Whether you are a philosophy major or someone who has not seen a single book on the subject, you may have come across the term Occam's razor. It is one of the oldest guiding principles that is still relevant today. And as long as the human mind prefers metaphors and grand ideas, Occam's razor will always be useful. Before you assume that this is just a competitor to Gillette's new razor, let me add that there is no physical razor used here. It's a metaphorical razor that is used to shave off certain elements of an idea. In philosophy, the ideas we discuss are not only meant to be intellectual, but also practical. So this video will explain everything you should know about Occam's razor and how you can use it in your daily life to make better decisions and tackle complex issues. Let's start with the meaning and origin of the term. Occam has been derived from the name William of Occam, a friar in the 14th century who also dabbled in logic and came up with interesting ways to explain things. This law is also called lex parsimoniae in Latin, which translates to the law of parsimony or briefness, something which the Walking Dead did not understand. Here's what Occam's razor says. The simplest explanation, with the fewest assumptions, is usually the best one. Take note of the fewest assumptions part because it becomes important as we deal with complex ideas and scientific theses. When you come across something that you cannot explain or understand, the reasoning with the least assumption is usually the correct one. Here's an example. Imagine that you walk into your bedroom and see a wet patch on the mattress. This is a simple thing with multiple possible explanations, but we will take two. One, either a goblin who was running away with a pot of gold walked into your room, tripped with his water bottle open on your mattress, and then escaped. Or someone was sitting on your bed and drinking something which may have dropped and caused the wet patch. I know it sounds comical, but I have exaggerated the examples to show the basics of Occam's razor. Both examples are possible, but the first one takes hundreds of assumptions that are very far-fetched. The second one also takes some assumptions, but certainly less than the first. But let's settle down and take a more practical and complex example. Imagine that there's a pile of papers next to an open window. When you walk into the room, you notice some of the papers are on the floor. Even though there is no wind outside, you can assume two things. There might have been some wind which led to the papers falling, or someone walked inside, opened the windows, and then scattered the papers on the floor, and then walked away. Both of them are possible, but one is very likely, and it's the one with the least assumptions. Also, notice that the more assumptions you add for simple events, the more maniacal you sound. So stay sane and go for the simple explanations. Now you might say, Charles, I know these things. Why would we need a principle to explain something where common sense can do the job? Well, common sense is not that common, especially at the time when Occam's razor was thought of. Even before that, ancient Greeks talked about a similar idea of eliminating unnecessary elements from an explanation. And don't let these simple examples fool you. Occam's razor can be used in places where common sense does not really work. In fact, it works perfectly when your emotional part of the brain takes over the logical one. Take this example. Imagine that you run an online business with a website. Everything is going well until one day you notice a decline in your visitors' count. Since you cannot get a concrete reason why this happened, you need to assume the reason at first. Could it be that Google someone found something about your business and is now reducing your visibility? Or could it be that a recent change in your website design might have caused this issue? If you go with the first option, which has more assumptions as you need to justify how Google got to know about your business with a lot of assumptions, you might start changing your business, looking for clues that then require more assumptions. Or should you just check your recent activities and try to figure out what went wrong with the website design? Of course, you should go with the second one as it is more logical. But there is a supposedly fatal flaw with Occam's razor and similar principles that many people have pointed out. The most common example is the idea of God. Did the universe form out of the complex quantum process and a gazillion other ideas that we still do not know? Or did God create the universe? At first, applying Occam's razor would lead to the second, simpler assumption. This is what many theists have used to prove the existence of God. But there is an oversight here. When you pick the second, seemingly simpler option, you are opening a can of worms. But instead of worms, you get a lot of assumptions. Because to say that God created the universe, you need to assume that there is a God, which is a big assumption for such an important claim. In this scenario, a slightly modified version of Occam's razor is used, and it's called Hitchens' razor. You might be aware of Christopher Hitchens, one of the 4 horsemen of atheism. His version of the razor is what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Occam's razor has spawned 2 different principles that are used in both psychology and, surprisingly, designing. Hanlon's razor states that you should never attribute something to malice that can be adequately explained by stupidity, which means that you should not assume someone to be evil or scheming when their actions can be explained by ignorance. In design, a similar principle is called the keep it simple, stupid principle, or KISS. Instead of making something overly complicated, keep things simple and pleasing. One or the other form of Occam's razor has always been present in almost every field of knowledge. There is a famous saying in the medical field that goes like, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses and not zebras. This means that a doctor should first consider common diseases before assuming something rare. A zebra can show up when you hear the sound of hooves, but it is more likely and simple to assume horses. Perhaps the most important use of this principle is in philosophy and decision-making. Trust me, it can be the barrier stopping you from becoming a flat earther. Whenever you come across any conspiracy theory, notice how many discrepancies or assumptions there are to reach the conclusion. Then notice if there are more assumptions needed to validate the previous assumptions. That's when you should reject the entire idea or shave it off. Many times, Occam's razor can be a great tool for eliminating personal biases in decision-making. Illogical aspects that are often forced in by emotional thinking can complicate things. Always try to go for a simpler explanation that does not require complicated assumptions. But this does not mean you should never take the complicated route. The obvious one is that the simplest explanation cannot always be correct. Maybe the complex explanation requires some assumptions, but what if you do not have all the facts? This is why it's important to always keep an evidence-based approach first, and then go for the Occam's razor approach. It should always be used primarily when there is little or no evidence, and for simple situations. For example, when we deal with complex issues such as rising crime, it is often simpler to just say that people become criminals because of poverty or greed. But the explanation for crime can be extremely complicated, from mental conditions, economic conditions, childhood trauma, lack of education, and even genetic factors. Remember that Occam's razor is only valid when you take the explanation with a lesser number of assumptions, not variables or evidence. Remember that this is not a rule, but a heuristic. Occam's razor can be used as a guide or a compass. It's not a definitive map like scientific proof. And that was all about Occam's razor. I hope you got an easy and simple explanation of this principle. As you might have noticed, this is the first video on the channel. So wish me luck and subscribe if you like to grow as a person and become a better philosopher and sharpen your intellect. I am Charles, and we will meet on the next one. Till then, stay sharp and keep getting better.